When we speak about Babylon, one of the most legendary cities of the ancient world, our imagination immediately paints colossal walls, ziggurats rising into the sky, and golden idols glimmering in the sacred light of oil lamps. Babylon was not only the center of trade and power, but also the cradle of myths, cults, and rituals that continue to disturb the imagination even today. Among them, the most famous and the most controversial is the cult of the goddess Ishtar, where, as ancient authors claimed, chastity itself was sold on the altars of the temple. This shocking claim, that every Babylonian woman once in her life had to surrender her body to a stranger in the temple of Ishtar as a form of sacrifice, has echoed through centuries. It was repeated by Greek historians, retold by Roman chroniclers, and later taken up by medieval travelers who sought to portray Babylon as the city of sins, doomed for its lustful devotion. But as we begin this story, it is important to distinguish between what is true and what was exaggerated, distorted, or perhaps deliberately invented. The truth that can be revealed immediately is the following. Babylonian religion was deeply intertwined with sexuality, fertility, and the cycles of nature. Ishtar, the goddess at the center of these cults, embodied both love and war, tenderness and destruction. She was the protector of lovers, but also the mistress of battles. Her worship was not simply sensual, it was mystical, bound to the idea that fertility and procreation were sacred acts, directly linked to the survival of society. This is why temples dedicated to Ishtar were not only places of worship but also centers of ritualized sexuality. The act of union, according to Mesopotamian belief, could imitate the union of gods, thus renewing the world. However, what exactly took place within those temple walls is where history and myth intertwine so tightly that even today historians debate whether the shocking stories told by later authors are based on fact, distortion, or propaganda. The most famous description comes from the Greek historian Herodotus. In his work, he claimed that every woman in Babylon was required, at least once in her life, to go to the temple of Ishtar, or Melita as he called her, and sit there until a stranger threw a coin into her lap. That coin, regardless of its value, had to be accepted, and the woman was obliged to follow the man into the temple and give herself to him. This act was not seen as shameful but sacred. It symbolized devotion to the goddess. After that, the woman was freed from her obligation forever. Such a description shocks the modern reader, but even in antiquity it caused suspicion. Other authors either ignored or questioned this custom. Some noted that it was unlikely such a ritual could exist in the form described by Herodotus, for Babylonian society was highly stratified, and women of noble families would hardly have been forced to sit among commoners. Moreover, Babylonian legal codes and religious hymns that have survived to us do not mention such a universal requirement. Instead, they describe priestesses and temple prostitutes who may have practiced sacred sexuality, but not a compulsory ritual for every woman. And here lies the first revelation of our story. What many later generations repeated as an indisputable fact may in reality be part of a conspiracy, an intentional attempt to portray Babylon as the embodiment of sin. It is important to remember that Herodotus and later Greek and Roman authors often described the customs of foreign peoples with exaggeration, irony, or moralizing undertones. Babylon, the great rival of the West, became for them a perfect example of a corrupt city, which deserved its fall. Yet, at the same time, there is a deeper truth behind these words. The Temple of Ishtar was indeed a place where ritual sexuality could take place, but in a completely different form. Among the priestesses of the goddess, there existed various ranks, and some of them were dedicated to sacred prostitution. These women were not forced into the temple. They belonged to it, serving the goddess with their bodies. To the Babylonian mind, such a service was not considered shameful. On the contrary, it was a holy duty, a ritual of communion with the divine, where the sexual act symbolized the cosmic union of heaven and earth. Thus, we find ourselves between two extremes. On the one hand, the myth of universal female sacrifice; on the other hand, the real existence of sacred sexuality tied to the cult of Ishtar. This duality has generated centuries of speculation, moral debates, and conspiracies. Was Babylon truly a city where every woman sold her chastity at the temple gates? Or was it, Rather, a city where a select group of priestesses performed rituals that outsiders later misrepresented or deliberately distorted. The answer, as always in history, lies somewhere in the middle. But to understand it, we must go deeper, into the very heart of Mesopotamian religion, into the songs dedicated to Ishtar, into the laws written on clay tablets, and into the dusty testimonies of ancient travelers. Only then will the true picture emerge, revealing not only the practices of the Babylonians but also the motives of those who sought to describe them in the darkest of colors. And this is where our journey begins. The Temple of Ishtar is not simply a monument of religion. It is a mirror of human fears and desires, a symbol of how sacred and profane can intertwine. The further we go, the more conspiracies will unfold. Conspiracies not only within the temple itself but also in the way history was written about it. Because sometimes the greatest secrets are not hidden in the rituals of the past, but in the way those rituals were remembered and retold. Update 1. If in the first part we unraveled the veil of myth surrounding the cult of Ishtar, in this part we will enter the very chambers of the temple. Here, behind carved doors and between stone walls covered with cuneiform inscriptions, a hidden hierarchy of women existed. They were not ordinary worshippers but the chosen servants of the goddess. Their lives were tied not only to ritual sexuality but also to the politics of Babylon itself. For the cult of Ishtar was not merely a matter of faith. It was a machine of power, a theater where kings, priests, and women bound to the goddess all played their parts. The Temple of Ishtar was one of the most important religious centers in Babylon. Built of mud brick, decorated with glazed tiles depicting lions and stars, the symbols of the goddess. It was at once a sacred place and an institution that controlled enormous resources. The temple owned land, slaves, and herds of cattle. It received offerings in silver, grain, and wine. And it was managed by a caste of priests and priestesses whose influence reached far beyond the altar. Among the women dedicated to Ishtar, there were several distinct categories. Ancient sources mention the Kadistu, the holy women, who held a high and respected position. They were not simply prostitutes of the temple. Rather, they were priestesses who lived within the sacred enclosure, devoting their bodies to ritual acts that symbolized the union of gods. The term Kadistu carried an aura of sanctity, not shame. In hymns to Ishtar, they are described as pure women of the goddess. Below them were other groups whose duties may have varied. Some were singers, dancers, or musicians, for music played an important role in Babylonian ritual. Others may indeed have engaged in what we would call sacred prostitution, offering their bodies to worshippers who sought union with the divine through physical intimacy. But even here, the act was not perceived as base lust. It was a prayer in flesh, a sacrifice no less holy than burning incense. Yet not all of these women chose this path willingly. Some were dedicated to the goddess from childhood by their families, much like later Christian parents would dedicate children to monasteries. Others were given to the temple as a form of repayment for debts. Thus, the Temple of Ishtar became a place where the lines between freedom and bondage blurred. A woman could rise to power within its walls, becoming a respected priestess, or she could remain a servant, bound to rituals not of her choosing. And here lies the second revelation of our story. The cult of Ishtar was not merely religious, it was political. Kings of Babylon understood well that to rule the city, they had to be united with its goddess. This belief was embodied in the ritual known as the sacred marriage. During the New Year festival, the king himself would enter the temple of Ishtar and ritually unite with the high priestess of the goddess. This act symbolized the union of heaven and earth, ensuring the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the kingdom. But beyond symbolism, this ritual was a declaration of legitimacy. By lying with the priestess of Ishtar, the king demonstrated that the goddess herself had chosen him as her earthly representative. Thus, the Temple of Ishtar held the power to crown or destroy kings. A priestess who denied the sacred union could delegitimize a ruler. A priestess who granted it could make even a usurper appear as the rightful sovereign. In this way, the temple became a stage of conspiracies. Behind the closed doors of the sacred chamber, not only rituals of flesh were performed, but also decisions that determined the fate of Babylon. Who would become king? Who would be overthrown? which family would gain influence. All of this could be decided under the guise of worship. And this is where the myth of universal prostitution begins to reveal its deeper purpose. Greek authors, unfamiliar with the subtle hierarchies of Babylonian religion, may have seen women sitting in the courtyards of the temple, waiting for worshippers. They may have heard rumors of the sacred marriage, in which the king himself gave his body to the goddess through her priestess. To the eyes of foreigners, these practices may have seemed like mass debauchery. But in truth, what they witnessed was a carefully constructed system of sacred politics, where sexuality was the language of divine authority. Imagine now the atmosphere within the temple during the New Year festival. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls. Incense fills the air with the scent of cedar and myrrh. The crowd outside chants hymns to Ishtar, the goddess of fertility and war. Inside, the high priestess, dressed in jewels and robes of deep blue, awaits the king. The king enters, wearing a golden crown, his face solemn, for what he is about to perform is not mere pleasure. It is the binding of heaven and earth. When the ritual act is completed, the priests proclaim the land blessed, the harvest secure, and the king chosen by the goddess. The people rejoice, never knowing that behind this divine theater lies a brutal truth. Those who control the temple of Ishtar control the throne of Babylon. Thus, the cult of Ishtar was not a marginal practice but a central mechanism of power. And the women who served within its walls were not mere instruments. They were both victims and players. Some were exploited, bound to rituals against their will. Others became powerful figures, whose word could shape the fate of an empire. Here lies the paradox that continues to haunt historians. Was the cult of Ishtar a sacred expression of cosmic order, or was it a tool of manipulation, where the bodies of women and the faith of the people were used to legitimize the ambitions of rulers? The answer, perhaps, is both. And this duality leads us to the next layer of the conspiracy. For if the temple of Ishtar was truly a machine of power, then surely not all were content with its rule. There were those who sought to undermine it, to expose it, to destroy it. And indeed, in the later centuries, as Babylon fell under foreign domination, the image of the temple of Ishtar became darker and darker, painted as a place of sin and corruption. This, too, was part of a grand design. For to slander the goddess was to slander Babylon itself. And in the next part of our story, we will see how the cult of Ishtar became a battlefield of propaganda, where enemies of Babylon used myths of prostitution and debauchery as weapons more powerful than swords. Update 2. As long as Babylon flourished, the temple of Ishtar remained a heart that pumped life into the city's veins. Its hymns echoed across the Euphrates. Its rituals renewed kingship. Its priestesses commanded both reverence and fear. But with Babylon's fall, the temple became something else. It became a memory, and memories, as history shows us, are not preserved neutrally. They are reshaped by victors, rewritten by enemies, and often poisoned with accusations meant to erase the past. The Persians were the first to turn Babylon's sacred heart into a target of political slander. When Cyrus the Great entered the city in 539 BC, he presented himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator chosen by Babylon's own gods. In his famous Cyrus Cylinder, he claimed that Marduk, the supreme deity of Babylon, had guided him to victory. But the temple of Ishtar, with its dangerous political influence, could not remain intact. It was not simply a sanctuary, it was a rival power that had once crowned kings and legitimized dynasties. For Cyrus, control of Babylon meant undermining that rival. It was in this period that whispers began to grow louder, whispers of indecency, of sacred acts portrayed not as divine rituals but as debauchery. To tarnish the temple was to weaken its influence, to turn the people away from their former sanctuaries. Slowly, the idea took root. The temple of Ishtar was not the house of a goddess, but the den of harlots. Later, the Greeks would seize upon this image with gusto. For the Greeks, Babylon was both a wonder and a threat. Its ziggurats dwarfed their own temples, its wealth rivaled their cities, and its ancient traditions stretched further back than their myths. How, then, to diminish such a rival in the cultural imagination? By portraying it as corrupt. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, delivered the most infamous description. In his pages, the Temple of Ishtar became the stage of universal prostitution, where every Babylonian woman, from the poorest servant to the richest noble, was forced once in her life to sit within the sacred enclosure, waiting for a stranger to throw a coin into her lap. The act, he claimed, was mandatory, an initiation into society through ritual shame. To his Greek readers, this account confirmed everything they wanted to believe about the barbarian East. Babylon was no longer a city of science, law, and architecture. It was a city of decadence. The great ziggurat of Etemenanke, which inspired the later story of the Tower of Babel, was overshadowed in memory by the imagined spectacle of women lined up in a temple courtyard, waiting to sell their bodies under the gaze of a goddess. But we must ask, was Herodotus telling the truth, or was he telling a story? Modern historians lean toward the latter. Babylonian records, those thousands of clay tablets covered in cuneiform that archaeologists have uncovered, never once mentioned such a universal obligation. Instead, they describe structured temple hierarchies, voluntary priestesses, and ritual acts tied to festivals and fertility rites. No law, no hymn, no inscription demands that every woman surrender herself at the gates of Ishtar. This silence in the native sources reveals much. It suggests that Herodotus and later Greek writers may have confused the visible rituals of temple prostitution, performed by priestesses and votaries, with a general practice. Or, more likely, they deliberately exaggerated what they saw or heard into a scandalous tale, reshaping ritual into rumor and rumor into propaganda. The Romans would carry this image further. For them, Babylon was already a ruined city, a ghost of the past. To Roman authors, describing Babylon as a cesspool of lust served two purposes. First, it justified the city's destruction. What else could become of a nation so drowned in vice? Second, it provided a cautionary tale for their own people. Rome, too, was an empire of great wealth and temptation, and Babylon became a mirror of what they feared becoming. When Christianity rose centuries later, the story of Babylon was reshaped once more. In the Book of Revelation, Babylon became the great whore, the mother of abominations, clothed in purple and scarlet, drunk on the blood of saints. This was no longer the historical Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar and Ishtar. This was Babylon as symbol, an eternal image of sin, corruption, and lust punished by divine wrath. And at the heart of this image lay the memory of that temple, said to have sold chastity in sacrifice. Thus, the cult of Ishtar, whether real or imagined, became more than history. It became a weapon. Enemies of Babylon turned its rituals into scandals, its priestesses into prostitutes, its sacred acts into depravity. The memory of the temple was chained, reshaped, and locked within a narrative of sin. But beneath this propaganda, something remains unresolved. For if the Greeks and Romans exaggerated, if the Christians demonized, then what was the truth? The temple was real, the rituals were real, and the priestesses were real. The myths may be distortions, but distortions often grow from a kernel of truth. Somewhere between the clay tablets of Babylon and the words of Herodotus lies the secret of what truly happened within those sacred walls. And here we arrive at the third revelation of our story. The cult of Ishtar did not die with Babylon's fall. Its memory lived on, not only in accusations but in transformation. The goddess herself, Ishtar, did not vanish. She was reborn as Astarte among the Phoenicians, as Aphrodite among the Greeks, as Venus among the Romans. Each time she changed her name, she carried with her fragments of her old cult, the connection between sexuality and divinity, between love and power. The scandal of Babylon became the foundation of mythologies that spread across the Mediterranean world. The idea that sexuality could be sacred survived, but it was reshaped, softened, romanticized. Where Babylon had placed priestesses at the center of political power, Greece turned the goddess of love into a myth of beauty. Where Babylon had sanctified ritual union, Rome turned Venus into the patroness of desire. The original, dangerous truth that sex itself could be a ritual of power was buried under centuries of retelling. But as long as those stories were told, the conspiracies continued. Was Babylon destroyed because of its lust, as the Greeks and Christians claimed? Or was it destroyed because enemies feared the power of its goddess, and thus smeared her cult to justify conquest? In the next and final part of our story, we will strip away the last veil. We will look at the ultimate conspiracy, the transformation of the Temple of Ishtar into the eternal symbol of the fallen city. We will ask why, across so many centuries, it was always Babylon, and not another city, that became the whore of the world. And in that final revelation, we may discover more about ourselves than about Babylon. Update 3. We have journeyed far, from the reality of sacred rituals in the Temple of Ishtar, through the hierarchies of priestesses and their role in politics, into the webs of propaganda spun by Persia, Greece, Rome, and finally Christianity. And yet, one question remains unresolved, the most haunting of all. Why Babylon? Why did this city, among the countless civilizations of the ancient world, become the eternal embodiment of corruption? Why is it Babylon that survives in our collective memory not as the city of mathematics, astronomy, and law, but as the great whore? The answer lies not only in history but in psychology and power. Babylon was not an ordinary city, it was the center of the world. For centuries it held unrivaled prestige. Its hanging gardens were counted among the wonders. Its astronomers mapped the heavens. Its kings built walls so vast that later writers claimed chariots could race upon them. Babylon's sheer grandeur made it an irresistible target. To destroy Babylon's reputation was to destroy the very idea of Babylon itself. And here lies the fourth and final revelation. The transformation of Babylon into the eternal symbol of sin was a deliberate act of cultural assassination. The Temple of Ishtar, with its rituals of sacred sexuality, provided the perfect weapon. For sexuality has always been the most vulnerable of human domains, both revered and feared, both sacred and shameful. By reducing Ishtar's cult to prostitution, by twisting ritual into debauchery, enemies could recast Babylon's glory into disgrace. The Persians began this work, but it was the Greeks who perfected it. For Herodotus, Babylon was the contrast against which Greece defined itself. Greece was order, Babylon was excess. Greece was reason, Babylon was lust. And by presenting the Temple of Ishtar as a marketplace of bodies, Herodotus gave his audience exactly what they wanted, a story that confirmed their superiority. The Romans continued the pattern. They took Ishtar, transformed her into Venus, stripped her of her political edge, and left only the soft, romanticized goddess of desire. Meanwhile, Babylon itself, already a ruin, was remembered only as a cautionary tale. To the Roman mind, Babylon was the example of what happens when a city loses its moral discipline. Then came Christianity, and with it, the final blow. The Book of Revelation did not simply describe Babylon, it mythologized it. The author, writing in a time when Rome itself was persecuting Christians, used Babylon as a code word for the empire of his own day. By calling Rome Babylon, he invoked the memory of the fallen city as the archetype of corruption. But in doing so, he ensured that the historical Babylon would forever be chained to that symbol. Babylon was no longer Babylon, it was sin itself. The Temple of Ishtar, therefore, was never remembered for what it truly was. A place where religion, politics, and sexuality intertwined in ways both fascinating and complex. It was remembered instead as the place where women sold themselves under divine command. That one distorted image eclipsed centuries of history. It became the myth that survived when all the clay tablets and hymns were forgotten. And here we must pause, for the story of Babylon is not only about the past. It is also about us. Why do we cling to such myths? Why do we prefer the tale of universal prostitution over the truth of complex rituals and political power? The answer is simple, because the myth is more dramatic, more scandalous, more terrifying. A city that falls because of lust is easier to understand than a city that falls because of politics, economics, or shifting empires. Babylon became the symbol of sin not because it deserved it, but because humanity needed it to be so. There is a darker irony in this. The accusations hurled against the Temple of Ishtar were themselves tools of manipulation. Propaganda designed to control narratives, to justify conquest, to brand enemies as wicked. And yet, Those accusations survived long after the empires that forged them had collapsed. Cyrus, Herodotus, the Roman chroniclers, the Christian prophets, they are all gone. But their words remain fossilized in our culture. Babylon still lives, not in bricks and mortar, but in sermons, stories, and metaphors. So what then was the Temple of Ishtar, in truth? It was both more and less than legend tells. It was a place where priestesses devoted themselves to a goddess who embodied love and war, creation and destruction. It was a place where kings legitimized their rule through ritual union. It was a place where sexuality was sacred, not shameful, where the human body became a symbol of cosmic forces. But it was also a place of control, where some women were bound against their will, where power was concentrated, where rituals could be exploited for political ends. It was, in other words, a mirror of humanity itself. Beautiful and terrifying, sacred and profane, powerful and corrupt. And perhaps that is why Babylon has never left us. For in Babylon, we see both our greatest heights and our darkest shadows. The Temple of Ishtar stands no longer. Its bricks have crumbled. Its altars are dust. Its priestesses are forgotten. But its shadow stretches across time. Every time we speak of a city as Babylon, every time we associate power with corruption, every time sexuality is weaponized as scandal, we are repeating the old story. We are still living in the echo of that temple. And maybe this is the final truth. Babylon was destroyed not once, but countless times. It was destroyed in stone by Persian armies. It was destroyed in memory by Greek historians. It was destroyed in reputation by Christian scripture. And yet, in each destruction it was reborn, not as itself, but as symbol. Babylon the Great, the whore, the eternal warning of what happens when a city, or perhaps when humanity itself, dares to unite power, pleasure, and the divine. That is why we still whisper its name. That is why Babylon still haunts us. Not because of what it truly was, but because of what it has been made to mean.